The morning of June 15th should have dawned with nothing more troubling than the usual pre-wedding anxieties that afflict even the most composed of brides. Instead, it brought with it a most singular and disturbing crime that would transform what promised to be the social event of the season into something far more sinister. Thornfield Manor, that magnificent Georgian estate nestled in the Surrey countryside, had been prepared with meticulous care for the wedding of Miss Evelyn Thornfield to Sir Geoffrey Markham. The ancient oak-panelled halls gleamed with fresh polish, white roses cascaded from every available surface, and the staff moved about their duties with the quiet efficiency that marked a well-ordered household. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the bride's formidable grandmother and matriarch of the family, had spared no expense to ensure that her granddaughter's wedding would be remembered for all the right reasons. Yet by 8:30 that morning, as the summer sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, the wedding preparations had given way to something far more urgent. In the morning room, where the final arrangements should have been taking place, Lady Margaret Thornfield lay dead. She had been discovered by Pemberton, the butler, when he arrived to serve her customary morning tea at precisely 8 o'clock. The elderly woman was slumped forward in her chair at the writing desk, her silver hair disheveled, her face bearing the unmistakable pallor of death. Beside her lay an overturned teacup, its contents spreading in a dark stain across the leather-bound blotter, and scattered about were the morning's correspondence and what appeared to be her will, recently amended as the ink was still damp upon the parchment. Dr. Harrison, the family physician, had been summoned immediately. His preliminary examination suggested poison. The faint but distinctive odor of bitter almonds lingered in the air, and Lady Margaret's lips bore a telltale blue tinge that spoke of cyanide. The local constabulary had been notified, but Inspector Bradley, recognizing the gravity of the situation and the prominence of those involved, had made an urgent telephone call to Scotland Yard. It was in this atmosphere of shock and growing suspicion that I found myself, quite unexpectedly, accompanying my friend Hercule Poirot to Thornfield Manor. We had been in London on an entirely different matter when the call came through from Chief Inspector Japp, requesting Poirot's immediate assistance with what he termed a most delicate situation involving persons of considerable social standing. Mon ami Hastings, Poirot had said as our motor car turned into the tree-lined drive. Observe the perfection of this setting. The ancient stones, the carefully tended gardens, the very air of respectability and order. And yet, somewhere within this facade of English propriety, there lurks a mind capable of the most calculated murder. He adjusted his tie with characteristic precision and smoothed an invisible wrinkle from his immaculate suit. You will find, I think, that this crime was not committed in passion, but with the coldest deliberation. The timing, on the morning of a wedding, suggests a mind that delights not merely in murder, but in the destruction of happiness itself. As we approached the manor, I could see the evidence of the morning's tragedy in the hushed movements of the servants and the drawn curtains of what I presumed to be the morning room. A police constable stood guard at the front entrance, and through the diamond-paned windows I glimpsed figures moving about with the careful restraint of people trying to maintain normalcy in the face of the extraordinary. Pemberton, the butler who had discovered the body, met us at the door. He was a man of perhaps 60, with the bearing of one who had spent his life in service to the great houses of England. His composure was admirable, yet I noted the slight tremor in his hands as he took our cards. "Monsieur Poirot," he said with quiet dignity, "the family is most grateful for your prompt arrival. Miss Evelyn is most distressed, as you might imagine. The wedding, of course, has been postponed indefinitely." "Naturellement," murmured Poirot. "One does not celebrate a marriage in a house of mourning. Tell me, Pemberton, you discovered Lady Margaret at 8 o'clock precisely?" "Yes, sir. It was her custom to take her morning tea at that hour while reviewing her correspondence. When I entered with the tray, I found her, as she is now." "And you touched nothing?" "Nothing, sir. I summoned Dr. Harrison immediately, and when he pronounced her, When he confirmed what I feared, I notified the police as instructed. Poirot nodded approvingly. You acted with admirable presence of mind. Now, if you would be so good as to announce us to the family, I believe they will be eager to see this matter resolved with all possible discretion. As we were led through the manor's elegant corridors, I reflected on the peculiar irony of our situation. We had come to Surrey expecting nothing more eventful than a weekend in the countryside. Yet here we found ourselves in the midst of what promised to be one of the most challenging cases of Poirot's career. The closed circle of a country house, a family gathering for a wedding, and a victim whose death would undoubtedly unleash a torrent of secrets and suppressed resentments. It was, as Poirot would say, a crime most perfectly suited to his particular methods of investigation. The morning room remained sealed, but through the partially open door I caught a glimpse of the scene within. Lady Margaret's body had been removed, but the overturned teacup and scattered papers remained as mute testimony to the violence that had shattered the morning's tranquility. Inspector Bradley, a competent if unimaginative man, was photographing the scene with methodical thoroughness. "Ah, Poirot," he said, looking up from his camera. "Glad you could come. Nasty business, this. Cyanide, almost certainly. The question is how it was administered and by whom." Poirot surveyed the room with his keen grey eyes, taking in every detail with that peculiar intensity that I had learned to recognize as the prelude to his most brilliant deductions. "Indeed," he murmured. "And I suspect, Inspector, that before this day is through we shall discover that the answer to both questions lies not in what we can see but in what we cannot, in the hidden currents of family loyalty, jealousy, and greed that flow beneath the surface of even the most respectable English household." He turned to me with that slight smile that indicated his little grey cells were already beginning their work. "Come, Hastings. Let us meet the family and friends of Lady Margaret Thornfield. For among them, I'm certain, we shall find our murderer, and perhaps discover that this wedding was prevented not by chance, but by the most deliberate design." The game, as they say, was afoot, and in the elegant drawing-room of Thornfield Manor, where the wedding guests had gathered in shocked confusion, the stage was set for Hercule Poirot to unravel what would prove to be one of his most intricate and psychologically complex cases. The drawing-room of Thornfield Manor presented a tableau of barely contained emotion, Sir. Pemberton announced our arrival. The assembled company, family members and wedding guests who should have been celebrating, instead sat in clusters of whispered conversation and suppressed anxiety. The morning light, filtering through tall windows, illuminated faces marked by shock, grief, and something else entirely, the unmistakable tension of people who suddenly find themselves under suspicion. Miss Evelyn Thornfield rose from a chintz-covered sofa with admirable composure, though her reddened eyes betrayed recent tears. She was not the fragile English rose I had expected, but rather a young woman of quiet strength, her dark hair drawn simply back, and her grey eyes holding both intelligence and pride. Her wedding dress was nowhere to be seen, a telling detail that suggested she had already accepted the impossibility of her planned nuptials. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, inclining her head with old-fashioned formality, "I'm grateful you have come, though I confess I had hoped never to require such assistance." Poirot bowed with his characteristic precision. "Mademoiselle, to lose one so dear on what should have been your most joyous day, c'est cruel, most cruel indeed." Standing protectively beside her was Sir Geoffrey Markham, a fair athletic man of perhaps 35 whose handsome features bore the strain of the morning's events. His handshake was firm, his blue eyes direct, yet I detected something guarded in his manner, the careful control of a man accustomed to concealing his thoughts. "If you can resolve this matter discreetly, Monsieur Poirot," he said, "the family will be forever in your debt." The other occupants of the room arranged themselves as if upon a stage. Lady Veronica Marsh, Lady Margaret's younger daughter, sat with rigid composure in a high-backed chair, her handsome but austere features betraying nothing beyond proper grief. Every fold of her dark silk dress was perfectly arranged, yet the whiteness about her mouth suggested considerable inner turmoil. Near the fireplace, a striking young woman with auburn hair smoked with studied nonchalance. This was Clara Marsh, Lady Veronica's daughter, whose green eyes held an almost insolent curiosity as she observed our entrance. Her casual manner seemed deliberately provocative, a performance designed to demonstrate her indifference to the morning's tragedy. By the window stood Henry Thornfield, Lady Margaret's son, a man whose face bore the unmistakable marks of disappointment and dissipation. Once handsome, he had allowed himself to run to seed, and there was something both bitter and resigned in his expression as he turned from his contemplation of the gardens. "Since we're cataloguing the family, Monsieur Poirot," he said with barely concealed resentment, "I suppose we're all suspects now. That's how these things work, isn't it?" Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "An interesting assumption, Monsieur Thornfield. What makes you so certain this is a matter requiring suspects?" Before Henry could reply, Inspector Bradley cleared his throat. "We've established the cause of death, Poirot. Cyanide poisoning, almost certainly. The question is how it was administered, and by whom." "Ah, oui," murmured Poirot, his keen grey eyes moving systematically around the room. "And I observe that the papers upon Lady Margaret's desk included a recently amended will. The ink was still damp when we arrived. N'est-ce pas?" A subtle ripple of tension passed through the assembled company. Sir Geoffrey's hand tightened imperceptibly on the mantelpiece. Clara's cigarette trembled almost invisibly between her fingers. Lady Veronica's eyes closed for the briefest moment, a reaction so fleeting that only Poirot's trained observation would have caught it. "How did you—" Evelyn began, then stopped herself. "The evidence speaks to those who know how to listen, mademoiselle," Poirot replied gently. "Tell me, was this change in the will a matter of common knowledge among the family?" Lady Veronica's voice was carefully controlled. "Mother made no secret of her intentions. She liked to keep us all perfectly aware of our positions. Or our complete lack of them," Henry muttered darkly. Clara gave a short, bitter laugh. "Grandmamma enjoyed the power. She delighted in reminding us that we danced to her financial tune." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And now that hand which held the purse strings is forever stilled. The inheritance hangs in the balance, waiting to be claimed. You understand, do you not, how this must appear to the authorities?" The silence that followed was profound and telling. In that moment, each person in the room seemed to realize simultaneously that they were no longer merely mourners at a family tragedy. They were suspects in a calculated murder. "Précisément," Poirot said softly. "We have here a most perfect circle of opportunity and motive. The game, as they say, has begun." Inspector Bradley's suggestion of proceeding in an orderly fashion met with Poirot's evident approval. He adjusted a small porcelain figurine on the mantelpiece with characteristic precision, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the marble surface, a gesture that served to remind everyone present of his methodical nature and unyielding demand for order in all things. "Précisément, Inspector," Poirot murmured. "Order is indeed dear to my heart. We shall speak with each person individually, and I shall require the use of a quiet room where confidences may be shared without distraction." The library proved ideal for this purpose. Its mahogany-paneled walls and leather-bound volumes seemed to absorb secrets as readily as they did sound. Poirot settled himself in a wing-backed chair with characteristic care, indicating that I should position myself slightly to one side as witness to the proceedings. Miss Evelyn Thornfield was the first to be interviewed, her composure admirable despite the morning's tragic events. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her grey eyes meeting Poirot's steady gaze with remarkable directness. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began gently, "you will forgive the necessity of these questions, but I must understand the circumstances. At what hour did you last see your grandmother alive? Yesterday evening at dinner, Evelyn replied. Grandmamma retired early, saying she had correspondence to attend to and wished to review final arrangements for today's ceremony. Her manner was excited, almost triumphant. She mentioned making certain provisions that would ensure the family's future happiness. Poirot's grey eyes sharpened with interest. And this morning? You did not see Lady Margaret before her death was discovered? No. I remained in my room until Pemberton summoned me. It was unusual. Grandmamma often called for me in the mornings to discuss wedding details. Evelyn's voice faltered slightly. I thought perhaps she meant to let me rest on my wedding day. The will that was found upon her desk. Had she spoken to you of these changes? Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. She summoned me last night around 9 o'clock. She told me she had decided to make certain adjustments to ensure that worthy behavior would be rewarded. She mentioned attaching conditions to my inheritance. Something about not having the Thornfield fortune dissipated through unsuitable alliances. Très intéressant. And was there anything else of significance that occurred last evening? There was a scene in the library, just before 10 o'clock. Evelyn said, her fingers twisting together. I heard raised voices when I passed the door. Grandmamma was speaking very coldly. I caught her saying, "Then we understand one another perfectly. You shall have nothing, absolutely nothing." A man answered her, but I couldn't be certain who. Poirot leaned forward slightly. You suspect someone in particular? I think it was my father, but Geoffrey had been in there earlier as well, discussing the marriage settlement. When Sir Geoffrey took his turn, his handsome features bore the strain of careful control. Lady Margaret was thorough in her inquiries about my circumstances, he admitted with obvious discomfort. She insisted on certain financial arrangements, all perfectly standard, of course. Yet you were in the library yesterday evening. Briefly, yes. Lady Margaret wished to review some final details. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She could be quite exacting in her requirements. Henry Thornfield's interview revealed the full extent of the family's financial desperation. He threw himself into a chair with careless abandon, his resentment palpable. Let's dispense with pleasantries, he said bitterly. Mother controlled every penny, and she used it like a weapon. My allowance was cut off 6 months ago, said I needed to learn responsibility at 43. We all danced to her tune because we had no choice. Clara Marsh brought defiant sophistication to her interview, lighting a cigarette despite Poirot's obvious distaste. Grandmamma disapproved of everything about me. My independence, my writing, my refusal to marry some dreary squire. She'd threatened to cut me off entirely after Evelyn's wedding. Lady Veronica proved the most composed, yet Poirot sensed steel beneath her ladylike exterior. Mother was a woman of strong opinions, she said carefully. She believed in maintaining family standards. My late husband left me comfortable, but Mother controlled the bulk of the fortune. She used that control to ensure we remained attentive to her wishes. As each interview concluded, Poirot's understanding of the household dynamics deepened. Here was a family ruled by financial tyranny, where Lady Margaret's death would inevitably shift the balance of power. Each person had revealed not only their dependence upon the deceased woman's generosity, but also their individual reasons for resentment. Eh bien, Hastings, Poirot murmured as the last interview ended. We have a most perfect collection of motives. Financial desperation, thwarted independence, threatened disinheritance, and somewhere among these troubled souls lies our murderer. He rose and straightened his jacket with characteristic precision. But which of them possessed not only the motive, but the means and opportunity to transform resentment into murder? That, mon ami, is what we must now discover. The game was indeed afoot, and the first moves had been played. Inspector Bradley approached the investigation with the methodical thoroughness that had earned him his reputation at Scotland Yard. By mid-afternoon, he had assembled what appeared to be a comprehensive picture of the morning's tragic events, though Poirot observed his colleague's growing confidence with characteristic reserve. "The evidence speaks quite clearly," Bradley announced as we gathered once more in the library. "I've traced every movement of that fatal cup of tea from kitchen to morning room, and I believe we have our sequence of events." He consulted his notebook with evident satisfaction. At 7:45, Mrs. Hartwell prepared Lady Margaret's customary morning tea. Pemberton collected the tray at precisely 8 o'clock and carried it to the morning room, where he arranged it on the side table while preparing the room. He then placed the cup on Lady Margaret's writing desk and withdrew. The room was empty when he left it. Poirot's grey eyes sharpened with interest. "And the tea itself, Inspector? You're certain of its preparation?" "Absolutely. 1 cup, 1 sugar lump. Lady Margaret's exact preference according to decades of habit. The teapot remained in the kitchen throughout." "Très intéressant," murmured Poirot. "Yet when we examined the scene, did we not observe certain irregularities?" Indeed, our return to the morning room had revealed several puzzling details that Bradley's systematic approach had initially overlooked. The overturned teacup, while clearly the source of the fatal poison, bore subtle inconsistencies that spoke to Poirot's trained eye. "Regardez, Hastings," Poirot had observed, indicating the delicate china with his characteristic precision. "This is not Lady Margaret's usual morning service." Mrs. Hartwell confirmed that Lady Margaret invariably used the blue spode for her morning tea, yet this cup is from the Crown Derby set, much finer china, reserved for special occasions. More intriguing still was the discovery of sugar crystals at the bottom of the cup. Dr. Harrison, when questioned more closely, had confirmed that Lady Margaret had been managing diabetes for several years and avoided sugar religiously. Yet someone had clearly sweetened her final cup of tea. Either our victim abandoned a lifelong habit in her final moments, Poirot had mused, or someone wished to ensure the poison would be masked by sweetness. Someone who did not know of Lady Margaret's medical condition. The kitchen investigation had yielded further anomalies. Mrs. Hartwell, that paragon of domestic efficiency, reported subtle disturbances in her precisely organized domain. "Someone had been in my kitchen during the night," she declared with unmistakable indignation. "The sugar bowl was moved, just slightly, mind you, but I noticed such things. And my Crown Derby cup was missing from the Welsh dresser, though it appeared on Lady Margaret's tray this morning." These discoveries created a fascinating puzzle of contradictions, but it was Inspector Bradley's afternoon breakthrough that seemed to provide the solution. His face bore the unmistakable satisfaction of a hunter who has cornered his quarry when he summoned us to witness his triumph. "We have our murderer," he announced, gesturing toward an ornate silver snuff-box that lay upon the library table. "Found this hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Henry Thornfield's study. Inside, a small vial containing potassium cyanide, a perfect match for the poison that killed Lady Margaret." The evidence was indeed damning. Henry's financial desperation, his bitter resentment toward his mother's control, the overheard argument from the previous evening, all the pieces seemed to align with devastating clarity. Moreover, Pemberton had admitted to seeing Henry enter the morning room very early that morning, well before the household was stirring. "He denies everything naturally," Bradley continued, "claims he's never seen the box before, insists it must have been planted. But the facts speak for themselves." Yet as I observed Poirot's reaction to this apparently conclusive evidence, I detected that familiar expression of thoughtful skepticism that indicated his little grey cells were working along entirely different lines. "Mon ami Bradley," Poirot said gently, turning the snuff-box over in his gloved hands, "I confess this discovery troubles me greatly. Not because it fails to incriminate Monsieur Henry, but because it succeeds too perfectly." He examined the ornate engraving with meticulous care. "Consider the psychology of our situation. We have a man desperate for money, yes, but also a man who has lived 43 years without resorting to murder. Does such a person suddenly develop the cold calculation necessary for poison? And if he does he then leave his instrument of death in so obvious a hiding place, to be discovered within hours of the crime? Inspector Bradley's confidence wavered slightly. Desperate men make foolish mistakes, Poirot. Précisément, Poirot agreed, but they also make desperate choices. The morning of his niece's wedding, with a house full of guests and servants, when suspicion must inevitably fall upon the family. Is this when a rational man, even a desperate one, chooses to commit matricide? He placed the snuff-box back on the table with deliberate care. No, Inspector. While your evidence is compelling, my little grey cells whisper of a more subtle game. Someone has taken great care to ensure that Henry Thornfield appears guilty. Perhaps someone who knew of his financial troubles, his resentment, his vulnerable position within the family. The room fell silent as the implications of Poirot's words settled upon us. If Henry was not the killer, then someone else had committed this carefully planned murder and deliberately arranged the evidence to implicate him. The true murderer remained among us, hidden behind a mask of grief and innocence. Eh bien, Poirot concluded, straightening his tie with characteristic precision, we have solved one mystery only to discover another. The question now becomes, who possessed not only the motive to kill Lady Margaret, but the cold intelligence to frame an innocent man for the crime? That, I believe, will prove the more challenging puzzle. The game had indeed taken a darker turn, and somewhere within the elegant walls of Thornfield Manor, a killer waited to see if their carefully constructed deception would hold against the relentless logic of Hercule Poirot's investigation. The afternoon brought what Poirot termed his little experiments in human psychology, a series of carefully orchestrated encounters designed to probe the hidden vulnerabilities of each suspect. He had dismissed Inspector Bradley's physical evidence not from stubbornness, but from a profound understanding that the human heart reveals its secrets through behavior far more reliably than through material clues. His first subject was Sir Geoffrey Markham, whom he encountered in the library, reviewing what appeared to be legal documents. Poirot settled himself with characteristic precision in the opposite chair, his grey eyes observing every nuance of the younger man's reaction. "The marriage settlement papers, Sir Geoffrey?" Poirot inquired with deceptive casualness. "Lady Margaret was most thorough in such matters, I understand." Geoffrey's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the documents. "Quite thorough, yes. Perhaps excessively so." "Ah, oui," Poirot murmured, leaning forward with that gentle persistence which had unnerved so many guilty consciences. "She made certain requirements, did she not? Financial arrangements that you found trying." The facade of composed grief began to crack. Geoffrey's face grew pale, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man confessing to more than he intended. "Lady Margaret had discovered that my estate is heavily mortgaged," he admitted quietly. "She insisted on a prenuptial agreement that would keep Evelyn's inheritance entirely separate from my affairs. More than that, she threatened to expose my financial situation to Evelyn if I didn't comply with her terms." Poirot's eyebrows rose with apparent sympathy. "A most uncomfortable position, and yesterday evening in the library, your discussion grew heated. She suggested that a man who concealed his debts might conceal other things as well. She had been making inquiries into my past, my business dealings. She implied that if I proved unsuitable, she would ensure the engagement was broken. Here was a motive of compelling force, not merely financial ruin, but complete social destruction. Yet something in Geoffrey's manner suggested his revelations were as calculated as they were damaging." Poirot's subsequent interview with Clara Marsh proved even more illuminating. She had maintained her pose of sophisticated indifference throughout the morning's proceedings, but under his gentle questioning, a startling truth emerged. "Your grandmother disapproved of your writing career," Poirot observed, settling himself opposite her in the morning room. "Yet I understand you have achieved considerable success?" Clara's green eyes flashed with defiant pride. Success that meant nothing to her. She considered my work scandalous, unsuitable for a lady of breeding. "Très intéressant. And what form does this writing take?" "Crime fiction," Clara replied with deliberate provocation. "Detective stories, actually. Rather successful ones, though I publish under a pseudonym to spare the family embarrassment." The irony was exquisite. Poirot's eyebrows rose with genuine interest. "Indeed. Then you possess considerable knowledge of the mechanics of crime?" "Including various methods of administering poison," Clara admitted boldly. "Cyanide, for instance, can be concealed in sweet substances to mask its bitter taste. Any competent mystery writer knows such things." This revelation hung in the air like a challenge. Yet as Poirot observed Clara's manner, he suspected her apparent candor masked something far more complex, the calculated misdirection of someone who understood exactly how such admissions would be interpreted. "Did your grandmother know of your professional expertise?" Clara's composure faltered. "She discovered my identity last month. She was furious, said I was bringing shame on the family name. She threatened to cut off my allowance and expose my pseudonym to the literary world." As the interviews concluded, Poirot moved through the manor like a watchful presence, observing the subtle interactions between suspects. He noted how Geoffrey's eyes would stray from Evelyn to glance at Lady Veronica with unreadable intensity. He watched Clara seek out Henry for whispered conversations that always ended with conspiratorial glances in his direction. During tea, Poirot planted one of his subtle challenges. "It is often said," he remarked to no one in particular, "that the most dangerous lies are those closest to the truth. A small falsehood, carefully woven into a tapestry of facts, can be most difficult to unravel." Lady Veronica's teacup rattled against its saucer. Clara smirked knowingly. Geoffrey frowned at some distant point. Each reaction told its own story. "The killer is watching us, Hastings," Poirot murmured as evening approached. "They believe themselves clever, but they have forgotten that a lie, however perfect, betrays itself through human behavior. The psychological game has begun in earnest." The evening brought an atmosphere of barely contained tension as the household gathered for dinner in the grand dining room of Thornfield Manor. The meal proceeded with mechanical precision, each course served and consumed in an almost ritualistic silence broken only by the soft clink of silver against china. Poirot observed the assembled company with his characteristic attention to detail, noting how grief had given way to something far more dangerous, the watchful wariness of people who knew they were under suspicion. It was during the dessert course that Poirot chose to break the oppressive quiet. His voice, when it came, was deceptively casual, yet every person at the table seemed to stiffen at his words. "It is most curious, is it not?" he began, delicately sampling a spoonful of lemon soufflé. "How the smallest details can reveal the greatest truths. Lady Margaret's morning routine, for instance. So precise, so unchanging. One sugar lump in her blue-spode cup every morning for decades. Yet today, we find her final cup was Crown Derby china, sweetened with sugar she had not used in years due to her medical condition." Lady Veronica's fork trembled almost imperceptibly against her plate. Sir Geoffrey's jaw tightened, while Clara met Poirot's gaze with studied defiance. Henry, slumped in his chair, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around the table. "Such changes in habit," Poirot continued thoughtfully, "suggest either a sudden abandonment of lifelong patterns or the actions of someone unfamiliar with Lady Margaret's true preferences. Someone who knew her public habits but not her private necessities." The silence that followed was profound and telling. Poirot allowed it to stretch, watching as each suspect grappled with the implications of his observation. Then, with characteristic precision, He set down his spoon and rose from his chair. Mes amis, I propose we adjourn to the drawing room. There are matters we must discuss, matters that can no longer be postponed. The gathering that followed possessed an entirely different quality from the morning's shocked assembly. Where grief had once dominated, now suspicion and fear held sway. Poirot positioned himself near the fireplace, his grey eyes moving systematically from face to face as he began his most delicate psychological probing. Each of you, he said quietly, possessed both motive and opportunity to commit this crime, yet murder requires more than circumstance. It demands a particular cast of mind, a willingness to cross a line that most find impassable. Tonight, I wish to understand which among you possesses such a mind. His questions came with surgical precision, each one designed to probe a different vulnerability. To Geoffrey, he spoke of the desperation that drives men to conceal their true circumstances. To Clara, he mused about the dangerous knowledge possessed by those who study crime professionally. To Henry, he explored the psychology of men who feel themselves cheated by life. To Lady Veronica, he delicately probed the resentments that can fester within families bound by duty rather than affection. Each response was carefully catalogued, each reaction noted and filed away in those remarkable little grey cells. Yet it was during this very process of psychological examination that disaster struck. Mrs. Hartwell's scream shattered the evening's tense quiet like breaking glass. We rushed to the butler's pantry to find Pemberton collapsed on the floor, his face bearing the unmistakable pallor of poisoning, a half-empty cup of cocoa overturned beside him. Dr. Harrison's swift examination confirmed our worst fears. Cyanide again, he announced grimly. The same poison, though administered in a smaller dose. He's unconscious but alive. Barely. The implications were immediate and chilling. Either our murderer had struck again, or someone was attempting to eliminate a witness who possessed dangerous knowledge. Poirot's reaction was characteristically decisive. "Inspector Bradley," he commanded with unusual urgency, "seal the house immediately. No one enters or leaves until we understand what has transpired. Dr. Harrison, you will remain with Pemberton constantly. His survival may be the key to solving this entire mystery." The search of Pemberton's quarters yielded a discovery of immense significance, a small leather journal hidden beneath his mattress containing detailed observations of the household's activities. The final entries proved particularly revealing. "Regardez, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice tight with concentration as he read from the journal. Our Pemberton was most observant. Yesterday evening at 9:47 he noted Sir Geoffrey leaving the library in apparent agitation. At 10:15 he witnessed Miss Clara entering the morning room through the garden door. Most significantly, he recorded seeing someone in the morning room at 7:30 this morning, well before the official discovery of Lady Margaret's body. The assembled family received this news with varying degrees of shock and alarm. The realization that Pemberton had been watching, recording, cataloguing their movements cast their earlier testimonies in an entirely new light. "The butler saw everything," Poirot murmured, his grey eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. And someone realized that his testimony could destroy their carefully constructed alibi. The method of Pemberton's poisoning proved equally revealing. Unlike Lady Margaret's murder, which had been planned with meticulous care, this attempt bore all the hallmarks of desperation. The dose had been insufficient, the timing hurried, the execution flawed. "Mes amis," Poirot announced as he faced the assembled suspects once more. "We have reached a crucial juncture. The attempt on Pemberton's life tells us that our murderer remains among us, that they possess intimate knowledge of this household's routines, and most importantly, that they are willing to kill again to protect their secret." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle upon the company. "But they have also revealed their greatest weakness, desperation. The careful planning that characterized Lady Margaret's murder has given way to hasty improvisation. and in their haste they have made the fatal error that will ultimately expose them. The drawing room felt suddenly smaller, more claustrophobic, as the reality settled upon everyone present. Somewhere among them sat a killer who had struck twice and might well be planning to strike again. The psychological game had entered its most dangerous phase, and Hercule Poirot knew that the next move would determine whether justice would be served or whether more innocent blood would be shed in the elegant halls of Thornfield Manor. The game, he concluded with quiet intensity, has become deadly serious indeed. The attempted murder of Pemberton had transformed the atmosphere at Thornfield Manor from one of shocked grief to something far more sinister, the claustrophobic tension of a house where everyone knew a killer walked among them. Inspector Bradley maintained his vigilant security measures, but Poirot understood that the true battle was being fought not at doors and windows, but within the human psyche itself. The critical deduction. As dawn broke over the Surrey countryside, Poirot made his way to Lady Margaret's morning room, now unsealed but still bearing the subtle traces of that fatal breakfast. His grey eyes moved methodically over every detail, and it was here, in the quiet light of morning, that he made the observation that would ultimately unravel the entire mystery. "Regardez, Hastings," he murmured, indicating the delicate china fragments that remained from the fatal cup. "We have been so concerned with the poison itself that we have overlooked the vessel that contained it. This is not merely any teacup, it is Crown Derby, the finest china in the house, reserved for the most special occasions." He knelt beside the evidence table where the fragments had been carefully arranged. Yet Mrs. Hartwell was most explicit. Lady Margaret invariably used her blue spode service for morning tea. Every morning for decades, the same ritual, the same china. Why then, on the morning of her death, did she suddenly abandon this lifelong habit? The implications were staggering. Someone had prepared Lady Margaret's final cup of tea, using china they believed appropriate for such an important occasion, not realizing that the victim's actual preferences were far more modest. More tellingly, they had sweetened the tea with sugar, something Lady Margaret had not used in years due to her medical condition. The killer knew of Lady Margaret's morning tea ritual, Poirot continued, his voice growing more intense, but they did not know its intimate details. They understood the public performance, but not the private reality. This suggests someone who observed the household from a distance, or someone whose attention was focused on larger matters rather than domestic minutiae. The psychology of an amateur. Dr. Harrison's morning report confirmed that Pemberton would survive, though he remained unconscious. This news prompted Poirot to share his growing understanding of their adversary's psychology. "We are dealing with an amateur, Hastings," he explained as we walked the manor's long gallery. "Someone who has studied the theory of crime, perhaps through literature or observation, but lacks the true criminal's instinct for detail. The first murder was planned with meticulous care, yet it contained fundamental errors that reveal the killer's inexperience." He paused before a portrait of Lady Margaret in her younger years, her eyes seeming to watch them with stern intelligence. Consider the psychological profile, someone capable of conceiving an elegant murder plot, yet prone to panic when circumstances change. The attempt on Pemberton was desperate, clumsy, the work of someone who had exhausted their capacity for careful planning. Conversations and revelations. Poirot's subsequent interviews with the household revealed new layers of complexity beneath the surface of family respectability. Clara Marsh, when pressed about her expertise in crime fiction, admitted to having discussed various poisoning methods with several family members over the years. "Grandmama was fascinated by my work, despite her public disapproval," Clara revealed with obvious discomfort. "She would question me extensively about plot devices, methods of murder, ways of concealing evidence. She said it helped her understand the modern world's fascination with violence." This revelation cast Lady Margaret's death in an entirely new light. Had someone used Clara's professional knowledge to plan the perfect crime, then attempted to frame her for it by making her expertise appear suspicious? Sir Geoffrey's interview proved equally illuminating. Under Poirot's gentle but persistent questioning, he revealed the true nature of his final conversation with Lady Margaret. She had discovered something, he admitted, his composure finally cracking. Something that would have destroyed not just my engagement to Evelyn, but my entire social position. She offered me a choice: comply with her wishes completely, or face utter ruin. And her wishes were, Poirot inquired, that I proceed with the marriage regardless of certain complications. She said she had made provisions in her will that would ensure the family's future, but only if I played my part exactly as she directed. The hidden pattern. As the morning progressed, Poirot began to discern a pattern that had been hidden beneath the surface chaos of family resentments and financial desperation. Lady Margaret had not been merely controlling her family's finances. She had been orchestrating their entire lives according to some grand design of her own. She was playing a game, Hastings, he explained as they reviewed the evidence, a complex game in which each family member was a piece to be moved according to her will. The killer understood this game well enough to turn it against her, but not well enough to avoid leaving traces of their amateur status. The psychological portrait was becoming clearer. Someone who had intimate knowledge of Lady Margaret's manipulative nature. Someone who had studied the family dynamics carefully enough to exploit them, yet someone whose criminal inexperience had led them to make crucial errors in execution. The approaching climax. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Thornfield Manor, Poirot announced his intention to conduct one final experiment, a carefully orchestrated gathering that would force the killer to reveal themselves through their own psychological weaknesses. The murderer believes themselves clever, he told Inspector Bradley with quiet confidence. They have constructed what they imagine to be the perfect crime, complete with a convenient scapegoat in poor Henry. But they have forgotten that perfection in theory and perfection in practice are entirely different matters. He adjusted his tie with characteristic precision, his grey eyes holding that familiar gleam of approaching triumph. Tomorrow, we shall gather all the suspects together and allow the killer to demonstrate, through their own reactions and responses, exactly how they committed these crimes. The psychological game is nearly at its end, and I believe our amateur criminal is about to discover that playing with murder is far more dangerous than they ever imagined. The stage was set for the final confrontation, and somewhere within the elegant walls of Thornfield Manor, a killer waited to learn whether their carefully constructed deception could withstand the relentless logic of Hercule Poirot's little grey cells. The following morning brought an atmosphere of barely contained dread to Thornfield Manor. News had arrived that Pemberton remained unconscious but stable, his survival now assured, though his testimony remained tantalizingly out of reach. The household moved through their routines with mechanical precision, yet every glance, every whispered conversation, every closed door seemed charged with significance. Everyone understood that they were living through the final hours before the truth would be revealed. Poirot requested the assembly of all parties in the drawing-room at precisely 11 o'clock. When the company gathered, he positioned himself not at the commanding fireplace, but at a small writing desk by the tall windows, where the morning light fell fully upon the faces before him, while leaving his own expression partially shadowed. It was a deliberate arrangement that allowed him to study every nuance of reaction while remaining himself unreadable. Poirot's systematic elimination. Mesdames et messieurs, he began with characteristic precision, we have established the facts of Lady Margaret's murder. Cyanide in her morning tea, administered in Crown Derby china, sweetened with sugar she had not used in years. We have also witnessed the clumsy attempt upon Pemberton's life, but facts, however compelling, tell us only what occurred. To understand who committed these crimes, we must examine the psychology of the participants. His grey eyes moved systematically across the assembled company. Sir Geoffrey, You admitted freely that Lady Margaret held your future in her hands. That exposure of your financial difficulties would mean social and professional ruin. Yet when she died, you did not react with the relief of a man whose greatest peril had vanished. Instead, you displayed genuine grief, the sorrow of one who has lost someone valued, not someone feared. Geoffrey's shoulders eased fractionally, though his expression remained guarded. Pride such as yours, Sir Geoffrey, does not simulate bereavement when liberation would be the natural response. I therefore eliminate you from consideration, for your emotions ring too true to be those of a murderer celebrating his victim's demise. Poirot's attention shifted to Lady Veronica. Madame, you have endured your mother's financial tyranny for decades, yet when questioned about resentment, you offered only diplomatic non-answers. But here is what troubles me. There exists a particular psychology of long-suppressed anger, one that produces cold, calculating revenge. In you, however, I find resignation, fatigue, even a kind of weary acceptance. These are not the emotions that fuel elaborate murder plots. Clara stirred restlessly in her chair. So you've eliminated 2 suspects through amateur psychology. How delightfully modern. Ah, mademoiselle. Clara, Poirot replied smoothly, you possess the most fascinating psychology of all. You understand crime professionally, its methods, its dramatic possibilities, its psychological foundations. You admitted that Lady Margaret questioned you extensively about murder techniques, that others in this household listened to your explanations. You are, in essence, the library from which our killer borrowed their ideas. Clara's green eyes sharpened dangerously. Are you accusing me of providing the blueprint for my own grandmother's murder? Not accusing, observing. You see, our murderer demonstrates extensive theoretical knowledge combined with amateur execution. They knew cyanide could be masked by sweetness, yet they failed to understand Lady Margaret's actual preferences. They planned with cleverness but executed with revealing errors. You, as a professional student of crime, would never make such elementary mistakes. The critical revelation. Poirot rose and moved to the Isa mantelpiece, where he arranged a small collection of items with meticulous care. The fragments of the Crown Derby teacup, a copy of Lady Margaret's amended will, and Pemberton's leather journal. These 3 objects tell us everything we need to know about our killer's identity, he announced. The teacup reveals someone who understood the household's routines from an outsider's perspective. The will shows us the motive. Not merely financial gain, but the prevention of a specific provision that would have destroyed the killer's carefully laid plans. And Pemberton's journal. He opened the leather-bound book to a specific page. Contains an entry that our killer could not have known existed until after the murder was committed. Listen to this. June 14th, 11:30 p.m. Observed unusual activity in the morning room. Someone was preparing tomorrow's tea service, replacing the customary blue spode with Crown Derby china. Most irregular. Made note to inquire with Lady Margaret in the morning. The silence that followed was profound and telling. Several faces had gone pale, but one in particular showed the unmistakable signs of genuine shock. The expression of someone realizing their most careful precautions had been observed and recorded. You see the problem this created, Poirot continued relentlessly. Pemberton had witnessed the preparation of the murder weapon. His journal entry, if discovered, would have identified the killer immediately. Hence the desperate, clumsy attempt to silence him, an attempt that betrayed the amateur nature of our criminal. The psychological trap. Poirot's eyes moved deliberately around the room, settling briefly on each suspect before continuing. But there is something more. Lady Margaret's amended will contained a specific provision that would have made this entire crime unnecessary, had the killer only waited. She had decided to remove all conditions from Evelyn's inheritance, stating in her own hand that true happiness cannot be legislated, only recognized. Evelyn gasped softly. She was going to. Indeed, mademoiselle. Your grandmother had experienced a change of heart. The very provision that our killer sought to prevent through murder was already being removed. The crime was not only unnecessary, it was counterproductive. The psychological pressure in the room had become almost unbearable. Someone shifted uncomfortably, the small sound seeming unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. And so we arrive at our final deduction, Poirot said quietly. We seek someone who had intimate knowledge of the household routines yet misunderstood their details. Someone who knew of Lady Margaret's will changes but not their complete content. Someone who possessed the theoretical knowledge to plan an elegant murder but lacked the criminal experience to execute it flawlessly. He paused, his grey eyes reflecting absolute certainty. Someone who understood that Pemberton's survival would mean their exposure, and who therefore acted with the desperation of the amateur criminal caught between discovery and escape. The drawing room had become a pressure cooker of suppressed tension. Somewhere among the assembled company, a killer sat trapped by the inexorable logic of Hercule Poirot's deductions, knowing that their carefully constructed facade was about to crumble entirely. Tonight, Poirot announced with quiet finality, we shall gather once more. By then, I believe our murderer will find their position quite impossible indeed. The psychological game is nearly at its end, and the truth, however carefully buried, will at last be revealed. The mask was beginning to slip, and Hercule Poirot, with the patience of a master craftsman, was preparing to remove it entirely. The final gathering convened in the library of Thornfield Manor as evening shadows lengthened across the Surrey countryside, casting the room in a theatrical chiaroscuro that seemed perfectly suited to the drama about to unfold. Poirot had arranged every detail with characteristic precision, chairs positioned in a perfect semicircle facing the great mahogany desk, every lamp adjusted to illuminate faces while leaving others in revealing shadow, every element calculated to create the ideal stage for his revelation. The assembled company filed in with the gravity of mourners attending a funeral, though in truth they were witnesses to something far more complex, the final unmasking of a murderer who had walked among them for days, hidden behind a facade of grief and respectability. Inspector Bradley positioned himself by the door, his presence a silent reminder that justice awaited. Dr. Harrison sat slightly apart, his medical bag at hand, should the evening's revelations prove overwhelming for anyone present. The systematic review. Poirot surveyed them all with those remarkable grey eyes, his expression bearing the weight of absolute certainty. The psychological game that had begun with Lady Margaret's death was about to reach its inevitable conclusion. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed room with crystalline clarity, we have reached the end of our investigation. Through careful observation, logical deduction, and an understanding of human psychology, I've identified the person who murdered Lady Margaret Thornfield and attempted to kill Pemberton. He moved to stand behind the desk, his hands resting lightly on its polished surface, the gesture somehow investing him with judicial authority. This crime was planned with considerable cleverness, yet executed with telling amateurishness. The killer possessed extensive theoretical knowledge of murder methods but lacked the practical experience to avoid crucial errors. They understood the household's routines, yet misinterpreted their intimate details. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the barely audible sound of quickened breathing somewhere in the assembled company. Let us review the evidence systematically, Poirot continued, gesturing toward the objects he had arranged with meticulous care. Lady Margaret Thornfield was poisoned by cyanide administered in her morning tea. The tea was served in Crown Derby china, sweetened with sugar, despite her lifelong preference for blue spode and her strict avoidance of sugar due to diabetes. This tells us our killer knew of her tea ritual, but not its intimate details. They were an observer of public habits, not a participant in private ones. His gaze moved deliberately around the semicircle. The poison itself, cyanide, reflects the hand of someone who had studied crime in theory rather than practice. It is dramatic, effective, but notoriously distinctive. The choice suggests someone who had learned of such methods through conversation or literature, rather than criminal experience. The psychological deduction. Poirot opened Pemberton's leather-bound journal with ceremonial precision. Our faithful butler recorded everything: the late-night preparation in the morning room, the substitution of china, even the identity of the person he observed. When our killer realized this journal existed, careful planning gave way to desperate panic. The attempt on Pemberton's life was clumsy, hurried, insufficient, the work of someone who had exhausted their capacity for elaborate schemes. He closed the journal with a soft sound that seemed to echo through the room. The psychology of this crime is most revealing. We seek someone who possessed intimate knowledge of the household, yet made fundamental errors about Lady Margaret's personal habits. Someone who understood the family's financial dynamics, but misinterpreted their ultimate resolution. Someone capable of long-term planning, yet prone to panic when circumstances changed. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. Several figures sat with unnatural stillness, but Poirot's keen eyes had already identified the subtle signs of guilt, the rigid posture that betrayed inner turmoil, the careful breathing of someone fighting to maintain control. The revelation. The person who committed this crime, Poirot announced, his voice ringing with the finality of absolute truth, is someone who saw Lady Margaret's will not merely as a document of inheritance, but as an instrument that would expose decades of carefully concealed financial crimes. His grey eyes fixed with laser-like intensity on one particular figure. "Lady Veronica Marsh, you killed your mother." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Lady Veronica sat perfectly motionless for a long moment, her aristocratic composure intact, her face revealing nothing. Then, slowly, something shifted in her expression, a subtle relaxation, as if a tremendous burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice carrying the same cultured tones as always, yet somehow different, emptied of the careful control that had characterized every previous conversation. "The complete deduction. From the moment I understood the true psychology of this crime," Poirot replied with gentle certainty. "You alone possessed the necessary combination of intimate household knowledge and fundamental misunderstanding of your mother's private habits. You knew she took morning tea, but you prepared it as you would for a special occasion. Crown Derby china, sugar for sweetness. Not knowing her actual preferences had changed due to medical necessity." He paused, allowing the logic to unfold with mathematical precision. "More significantly, you alone had endured decades of financial manipulation that would create the deep, cold anger necessary for such calculated revenge. But it was not the will's conditions that threatened you, it was the comprehensive review process that would have revealed your systematic embezzlement from the estate over 15 years. Lady Veronica's composure cracked slightly, a barely perceptible tremor passing across her features. "You cannot prove." "On the contrary," Poirot interrupted gently, "your mother's accountants have been most cooperative. The discrepancies are quite clear once one knows where to look. You used your position as a state administrator to redirect funds, always small amounts, always carefully concealed. But a complete will review would have exposed everything." The confession. Lady Veronica sat in silence for a long moment, then slowly nodded with something approaching relief. "Yes," she said quietly. "I killed my mother, and I attempted to kill Pemberton when I realized he had witnessed my preparation of the fatal cup." The confession hung in the air like a physical presence. Inspector Bradley stepped forward, but Poirot gestured for him to wait. "The irony," Lady Veronica continued with bitter composure, "is that I spent 15 years stealing from her, justifying it as compensation for the emotional tyranny she inflicted upon us all. When she announced the will review, I knew my crimes would be discovered. Prison seemed inevitable. Disgrace, ruin, the destruction of everything I had tried to preserve. Her voice grew stronger, as if the act of confession was liberating. I had heard Clara discuss cyanide, its effects, how sweetness could mask its taste. The method seemed appropriate, poetic even. She who had poisoned our lives with her control would die by actual poison. The final resolution. Poirot's expression held no triumph, only the grave sadness of one who has witnessed the full tragedy of human weakness. And so financial desperation, disguised as righteous anger, led to murder. The very control you resented became the instrument of your own destruction. As Inspector Bradley moved to make his arrest, Lady Veronica rose with the same dignity she had maintained throughout her life. The mask had finally fallen away completely, revealing the cold, calculating mind that had planned and executed 2 attempts at murder to protect a secret that was ultimately beyond protection. "The game is ended," Poirot murmured as the handcuffs were applied with quiet efficiency, "and justice, though delayed, will at last be served." The psychological game was over, and Hercule Poirot had once again proven that the human heart, however carefully guarded, cannot ultimately conceal its darkest truths from those who possess the patience and insight to read its hidden language. In the elegant library of Thornfield Manor, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the final chapter of Lady Margaret Thornfield's story had been written. Not in her own hand, but in the inexorable logic of cause and consequence that governs all human actions.